All right, so in this lesson, we're going to talk more in depth about relational databases and MySQL. So I briefly mentioned it in the previous video when we were talking about website management. We briefly mentioned MySQL, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into that and how that kind of works and functions, and we'll give you a little SQL primer. And I also want to introduce you to a program called MongoDB, which is not a relational database. It's a little bit different. It's pure JavaScript, and it works in a very interesting way. So I want to give you guys a little introduction to that. So this is going to be kind of the general database primer. And in this week's lab, we're just going to do a little intro to MongoDB. And then next week, we're going to get into using MySQL to build out a full stack WordPress install, when we'll kind of see all these different parts come together. So relational databases organize data based on common characteristics of the set. So we break our data into tables that have common elements to them. So for example, a unique ID might match customers to their transactions. So all the transactions would be in one table, all our customers would be in the other, and every transaction would have a customer ID that would relate back to our customer tables. And these utilize primary and foreign keys to do that job. So for example, our customers table would have columns called ID, first name, last name, address, phone, and email. And our orders table would have ID, customer ID, total, date, and status. The ID is the primary key of the customers table, and customer ID is the foreign key on orders. And MySQL and other relational databases use these relationships to allow you to build complex queries. So if I wanted to see all of a customer's orders or all the orders or basically all the customers' orders, we can organize our queries that way. Or if I wanted to see all the orders where the phone numbers were in a specific area code, you could also match the tables that way. So there are lots of different relational databases out there. MySQL is one of the most popular. Oracle is a MySQL database. Postgres, Microsoft SQL Server, SQLite, all of these are relational databases. They work off the premise of foreign and primary keys. So for example, this is MySQL. This is what it looks like in your terminal. And just like most of the other applications we use in this class, we're going to be interacting with MySQL from the terminal level. And this is an example of what that looks like. This is just a simple show databases query, and this shows all the different databases in our particular install of MySQL. And this is also called the MySQL shell, and it allows us to, or the MySQL monitor, depending on who you talk to, and it allows us to execute MySQL and SQL commands within our Linux environment. So these are some basic management queries for MySQL. We have show databases, use WordPress, which is telling MySQL that I want to use that particular database. Show tables, this prints out all the tables in our database. And select star from users is a basic SQL command that would print out all of the rows from our WordPress users table. So when you're working in the MySQL console, you have to issue these commands in order to get data back. This is how we interact with it. And we'll see later that there are some graphical programs that can also do this, but generally you want to be able to manage these things from the command line as well. So the SQL part of MySQL is SQL, or Structured Query Language. And that is a language in and of itself. And don't confuse MySQL and SQL. MySQL is the database software. SQL is the query language that's used to change and modify and view the data within our database. So it's a declarative language for managing relational databases, and SQL is used in many other databases as well. There is a MySQL flavor of SQL, but generally SQL is used in most of the relational databases. And we interact with them using primarily four main commands. Select, we use that to view the data, so selecting rows of data from our tables. The insert command, which is what we use to put data into our tables. The update command is used to update rows that already exist, and the delete command is used to remove rows from a particular database. So this example down here below, select star from table where ID equals 1. This would return all the rows from a table with all the columns. So the star means select all of the columns in a table, and then we have to tell MySQL what table we want to select from. And then the where clause tells us how we scope that query. So we don't want all of the rows. We just want the rows where the ID equals 1. And typically, because ID is a unique key, we would only get one row back from that query. So here are some other select commands. Select star from WordPress users where user login equals admin. And we'll be able to run all these queries next week when we install WordPress. Select user login email from WordPress where user login equals admin. Limit 1. This limit command will only allow MySQL to return one row in the database. So that speeds things up a little bit. And you can also see in this select clause, I only want the user login email and email address. I don't want all of the rows. There's a lot of, all of the columns. There's a lot of columns in the WordPress users table. So I'm only interested in the user login and the email. So these are two similar queries that return different data. So here's an insert command. We have insert into WordPress user meta values 1 test and test. And this insert command gives us the ability to add data to our WordPress user meta table. And we're basically telling MySQL what table we want to insert into, and then we give MySQL a list of values that we want inserted into that particular table. And as you can see here, I left the first column blank because in MySQL they have typically there's an ID primary key on the table that will auto increment, meaning MySQL will insert a value in there for us, and we leave that blank to allow MySQL to insert whatever is the next number in the series there. So again, like update or like insert, update is changing data on the database, except there's already something to update. We've already inserted a row into our database in order to use this. So we have update WordPress user meta. So we're going to update the user meta table, and we're going to set this particular column to this particular bit of information, in our case, cheeseburger. And because we don't want to update all the rows of meta value to cheeseburger, we want to make sure we use a where clause and only update that column when the umeta ID equals 20. So this will go find that row where umeta ID equals 20, and it will update the meta value column to cheeseburger. And then finally we have delete, which is delete from WordPress user meta where umeta ID equals 20, limit 1. So again, we're going to go and find our column or our row where user meta ID equals 20, and we're going to delete that row because of the command we're running here. And we've also used the limit 1 clause to make sure that MySQL only deletes one row, because there should only be one row in this case. So there are also graphical interfaces to MySQL. We don't always have to use the command line to update things. My favorite for Mac OS X is a program called SQL Pro. And SQL Pro is just a OS X native graphical interface for MySQL. So you can see here we have our different tables, we have our database up in the upper left-hand corner, and we can browse the rows in our database just like we would typically in a spreadsheet, or it's a very similar format to that. So we can see our columns and our rows and all of our data in a very visual format. The next one we have here is PHPMyAdmin, and this one's fairly popular, and some of you are probably familiar with it. And PHPMyAdmin is actually a web-based MySQL management tool. So this actually gets installed on the server where MySQL is, and we can go to a URL and view our database information. So those of you that use traditional hosting, you're probably familiar with this. Most web hosts provide a PHPMyAdmin account for you to access your databases, and a lot of times that's the only way you can manage your MySQL database. So this one's very popular. It has its disadvantages. It can be insecure. It's generally not a good idea to install this on production web servers, as it gives potential hackers or intruders another means in which to get access to your data. So not always the best option, but it's great for learning it's great for learning MySQL, and it also makes it very easy to manage your databases. This is called SQL YOG Ultimate. This is a Windows-based MySQL client. It's very similar to SQL Pro, has the same type of layout where you can run queries, look at your tables and columns and rows in a graphical interface like Excel, and it also lists your server and databases on the side. So very similar to SQL Pro, and a nice graphical interface for the Windows platform. So there are also alternatives to relational databases that are not based on foreign and primary keys. We have key value stores like Redis and Memcached, and these are just big giant tables of data, typically with a key and a value. So that key could be a numerical ID or a hash, and then some type of data value on the other side. So think of it as just a giant database that only has two columns, a key and a value, and it stores all the information in a big flat database. And these are very, very fast. They're not very flexible, but they're great for things like caching and data that's structured in a very similar fashion, where you only need a key and a value. There's also document-oriented databases like MongoDB and CouchDB. We're actually going to look at MongoDB in our lab today, and so you'll get a sense for that. And these are document-based databases where you have data sets stored in documents, and they're a little more flexible than a relational database. You don't need what's called a schema. You don't have to really think about your data beforehand. You can kind of add new columns to the different documents as you see fit. And I will show you a good example of this when we get into MongoDB, which is based on the JSON file format. And it's an interesting way to approach database design. So MongoDB is a scalable, high-performance, open-source, NoSQL database. So you'll see this term NoSQL a lot because it's not based on SQL like MySQL is. It's based on a document-type format. And it's a document-oriented storage, and I say JSON-ish because it's not pure JSON. It's a variant of JSON. But those of you who are familiar with the JSON file format will be very familiar with MongoDB. A very cool part of MongoDB is that it mirrors across LANs and WANs for scale, so we can duplicate our database in a bunch of different places and for easy replication and easy backups. So it also scales very well, and it's built to do that out of the box. And this is called auto sharding. And for those of you that have had to shard a MySQL database, which basically means splitting up your database into different chunks in order to make it run faster, you know what a pain that can be. Well, MongoDB does this sharding and scaling automatically, and that's part of the feature of the database itself. You query MongoDB using what's called a MapReduce, and a map and a reduce function is a little more complicated than straight SQL, but it allows more complex queries, and it generally fits better with the structure of a document-oriented database. And so this is a simple interaction with MongoDB here, and you can see that it's a JavaScript-based interface, so it should look a little bit familiar. And it's generally in these flat documents, which are really just JSON files. And you can see here this ID, object ID, name Jeff Ciardo. So everything is kind of like think of a JSON document as sort of a bunch of different key values in a set of curly brackets. So it's like a key value store, except you can have multiple key value pairs in a particular document. And the cool thing about this is I can add additional key value pairs to different documents without changing other documents. Whereas in MySQL, in relational databases, all of our data has to be the same. So if I have a table with 4 columns, every row I put into that table has only got to have 4 columns. And if I add a 5th column, I'm adding it to all the rows, not just one. So that's what gives MongoDB a little bit of flexibility. So in the lab today, your guys are going to be doing a little bit of experimentation with MongoDB. So study it and do a little reading on it and then go through the tutorial. I think you'll find it really interesting and kind of a different approach to databases than MySQL. We're going to also be using MySQL a lot too, so it's good to be familiar with both, but I want you to understand the difference between the different types of databases and where you would use one over the other. They're not necessarily interchangeable, so WordPress wouldn't really run well on MongoDB because it's not created in a document type fashion. It has to be relational. You have authors who have posts and you have comments which are on posts, so the relational database and the foreign and primary keys work well. But say I was building a database where I just wanted to store, say, a bunch of different Twitter posts. Well, each Twitter post could be its own document, and that gives me a lot of flexibility in how I store and manage that data. So it's important to think about what your data looks like and what's the most appropriate way and the most appropriate database technology to use to store that. So check on down below in the show notes and the reading, and move on to the labs. I think you guys will enjoy the stuff you have to do this week. So we'll see you soon.